Robinson to start talking about soil carbon. So hopefully Fiona's getting the screen sharing up. How are you going, Fiona? You getting there?
Yeah, sorry, struggling a little bit. I need to get the screen sharing button up first, don't I? Yeah, okay.
Yep.
You can share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see full screen soil carbon title slide?
Yes, we can see that. If you can turn your video off now, Fiona, you'll be right.
Okay. Okay. Okay, are we back in business? You see the full screen?
Mick here, I can see it, Fiona.
Okay, good, thanks. People hearing me okay?
All good, all good.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. So I'll just talk for maybe hopefully less than 30 minutes about soil carbon. I want to just cover a few, three main things. I'll say a few things about soil carbon, what it is, some facts and figures and definitions so that we're all sort of on the same page. I'll talk a bit about research on soil carbon that Agriculture Victoria did over the last, well, it's over a 6-year period, but it finished several years ago. And we're not currently actually working on soil carbon at the moment. And consider what we've learned from that and have a look at where we are now. And so, all right, so if you look at carbon stocks globally, soil is the biggest carbon pool. Well, the oceans are bigger, but soil contains more carbon than the atmosphere and the plants together. And this idea has led to the concept of carbon sequestration, where if we can get more carbon into the soil via the plants, that we can draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and so reduce the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and help to mitigate the greenhouse effect. So that's the basic idea. And so I'll say a little bit more about this, and no doubt Matthew will say a bit more later as well. So when we're talking about soil carbon, and I'll just talk about soil carbon, but what I really mean is soil organic carbon. So there's also soil inorganic carbon. They both originate in the atmosphere. The inorganic carbon is calcium and magnesium carbonates, limestone sort of material. And you can't really change that through management. So we won't really talk about that. What we're interested in is organic carbon, which comes through plants through photosynthesis for the most part. So a typical sort of carbon cycle diagram, you've got your plants photosynthesizing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they're releasing carbon into the soil. The plants exude carbon the whole time, soluble, easily decomposed carbon from the roots. Also the roots die and cells slough off and you get carbon entering the soil that way. You may get carbon entering soil via an animal through dung, and also just dry matter from the pasture or trees or whatever, just being mixed into the soil and into the soil that way. So the carbon, when it enters the soil, becomes the energy source for most of the microbes in the soil. And it's not just carbon, I should say. When we talk about carbon, in the soil, it never really exists as pure carbon, or very little of it does. It's usually combined with other nutrients and other compounds and elements, and it's organic matter. So, but we tend to just talk about carbon. So this carbon is decomposed by the microorganisms, and carbon dioxide is released. And for every cycle of decomposition through the microorganisms, the carbon becomes more stabilized, so more resistant to decomposition with every cycle. So you've got that decomposition spinning around, and you can also get losses from the system. You've got the plants respiring carbon dioxide, and you can also lose carbon through harvesting products or burning the plant material. Also soil erosion, or you could get loss of soluble carbon through runoff and drainage. The carbon exists in continuum of forms in the soil. So anything less than 2 millimeters, by convention, you can say it's considered to be soil. So you can get recognizable pieces of organic matter that are less than 2 millimeters. And through decomposition, it becomes more and more unrecognizable. The particles get smaller, and it becomes more resistant to decomposition. And we talk about soil fractions, and that's these different forms of carbon, but in reality, it's a continuum. And they all have different properties, but they're all really important in the soil. They play different roles. So the various functions of carbon, well known, apart from decomposition of organic matter, the decomposition is fueled by the carbon, but through the microorganisms. Carbon is very important for infiltration, retention of water, also storage and release of nutrients. It gives the soil its structure, really important for maintaining the aeration and drainage properties of the soil. And soils with a lot of carbon are more biologically resilient, so they're not so susceptible to disease as depleted soils. So just a bit more about the concept of soil carbon sequestration. So if we've got soil carbon up on the y-axis there, if we have a native ecosystem where the carbon is steady and we have carbon inputs that are equal to carbon losses, so it doesn't change through time. So this is what we think, this is the native state. We come along with agriculture and start cultivating and cropping perhaps, and the carbon levels almost invariably go down once we start agriculture. It's not always. There are situations where carbon levels can be higher under agriculture than in the native state, but it's quite unusual. So the idea with carbon sequestration is if we use better management practices, we can lift these carbon levels some way towards the level they were at in the native state, perhaps not the full way, but where you have a situation where your carbon inputs are now greater than your losses. And that's the concept of carbon sequestration. So it really captured people's imagination as, obviously a win-win situation. If you can increase your carbon levels, you not only potentially help to mitigate rising CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, but improve the soil and improve productivity of your agricultural practices. So the carbon balance in the soil at any one time depends on the carbon going in and the carbon going out. But if we want to estimate what effect any management practice will have on soil carbon, another important thing we need to know is the starting level of carbon. What's the initial level of carbon in the soil? That's actually crucial to know. So for measuring soil carbon, when you get a soil test done, the lab, the second of these methods is what's most commonly offered in farming circles. The state-of-the-art method is the dry combustion method, but it measures total carbon. So it's really important when you get a soil test to know whether the carbon level, the carbon value they're quoting is total carbon or organic carbon. So what you want to know is organic carbon. A lot of the soils in dry regions can have a lot of inorganic carbon. They might be 50% inorganic. So in the units will usually be percent carbon, but most labs would present that. If you're wanting to do carbon accounting, you have to be a bit more specific. You have to account for the bulk density of the soil and then either quote carbon levels to a certain depth or preferably an equivalent mass of soil. So it becomes a lot more complicated if you're actually wanting to do carbon accounting. So I won't say too much more about that. So just before I run through the two research programs, I just take you back to where we were when this work started. It's about 8 or 10 years ago. It's getting on a bit now. So at that time, there was great optimism and interest in soil carbon sequestration, in the idea, the potential of greenhouse mitigation and soil restoration at the same time. And there was a lot of proposed methods for sequestering carbon, many of them untested. And at that time, we had very little data for assessing what the realistic potential would be for carbon sequestration. So the federal government funded or co-funded 2 research programs on soil carbon over a 6-year period. And they involved most of the states, and including Victoria. So the first one was Soil Carbon Research Programme, and its objectives were basically to go out there and measure the existing levels of soil carbon in farmland, in agricultural land. It's as basic as that. We didn't know what carbon levels were in farming land at the time, or very poor knowledge of it. So in Victoria, we looked at pasture and cropping systems, and we investigated the relationships with management practices and soil and climate. In the second programme, it was National Soil Carbon Programme. It was all about getting evidence for how management might change carbon stocks. And again, it involved all the other states. But in Victoria, we looked at pasture and cropping systems again. And with carbon, it's really tricky measuring the effects of management, because there's not too many situations, experiments that have been running for a long time where you can measure it. So with the first program, where we went out to measure, doing basically a benchmarking study of soil carbon on farmland, we selected 8 regions in the state. We selected the dominant soil types, the management types in these regions. And we had 4 management classes: continuous cropping, crop pasture rotations, sheep and beef pastures, and dairy pastures. So that was our 4 categories. So we sampled soils to 30 centimetres depth in the same manner, we didn't sample whole paddocks because it was important for us to know exactly what soil type we're on. And so we sampled 10 by 10 meter areas within paddocks, and we took 10 cores from within these areas. And this is a map of the sampling regions. We had 630 sites altogether. You can see the different management classes, mostly cropping towards the north and getting more pasture and dairy towards the south. So clearly management's not independent of climate there. And for that study, we collaborated closely with many groups, farming groups, to help us find suitable sites and collaborating farmers. So we measured the carbon in 3 different depths. They're 10 centimeter increments, but I won't really say much about that. And we used the dry combustion method for organic carbon, total organic carbon. We also did a formal soil classification so that we could be very sure of what soil type we had. And what we found was an enormous range in the soil carbon stocks across the sampling sites in Victoria, from about 2 to more than 200 tonnes per hectare. And if you want to translate that roughly to more common units, if you had a 10 centimetre sample, that would be roughly 0.5 to 11% range. And half of the carbon was in the top 10 centimetres. So here's an example of a very low carbon soil. It's 4.5 tonnes of carbon. This is a very sandy soil from the Mallee under continuous cropping. And these soil cores were taken to a metre, but we only analysed the carbon in the top 30 here. And here's an example of the other extreme, a dairy farm with 185 tonnes of carbon per hectare. And you can see, well, obviously very different soil. Very dark in the top 30 centimetres. That's the carbon organic matter built up. And this slide really sort of summarises the findings of the START programme. What it shows is how all the different factors that we measured were related to soil carbon. Now, and the amount of influence they have on soil carbon. So what this shows is that climatic factors, we had vapor pressure deficit there. You could think of that as a humidity index, rainfall and temperature. They were by far the most closely associated with the organic carbon levels. And then there was the soil factors. We had clay. Silicon was a surrogate for sand content. Aluminium and iron, they came up as a little bit important. They tend to hold carbon. And soil classification, that's the soil type there in the blue dots. They were next most important. And then the management class down the bottom were, well, least important on this presentation. We also put in management practices such as within cropping, whether there's double retention versus double burning, and grazing systems, whether it was rotational grazing versus set stocking. But the management practices were way less, even less influential than the management class, as you might expect. So they were dropped out of the analysis. You couldn't find any difference in them. So the main finding here is that climate and soil together, that is, things that we can't change, they explain 82% of the variation in carbon. So that's really good to know. And here's the relationship with rainfall. It's basically, more rainfall, more carbon. you get an approximate straight line. And as a rule of thumb, you can say that soil carbon increases about 12 tonnes per hectare for every 100 millimetres of rainfall. There's variation there, of course, but generalisation across the state. So if we look at the different management classes, you can see very large differences here. And if you take that at face value, you might think, oh, you know, cropping and comparing it with pasture systems is a really big difference. The pasture is really making a big difference. But what you're seeing there is mostly a climate effect. Just look where these different management systems are located. So what this says is if you want to measure the effects of management on soil carbon, you have to control the effects of climate and soil type also, but to a lesser extent. So we did that. This shows soil carbon levels across the Victorian volcanic plains, sort of between Hamilton and Geelong, basically. And we compared cropping with long-term pastures. And there's variation there, of course, as well, and plot it against rainfall. But the pastures are about 10 tonnes per hectare higher in carbon than the cropping systems. Now that's a lot less than what the previous slide would have suggested. But there is a difference there, and you can measure it, but it's a lot smaller than you might think just by looking at management groups. So with it, I should say also in this study, we paired rainfall and soil type very closely. So we had clay content matched really closely in the cropping site and the pasture site. They were paired sites, 40-odd paired sites. Another way of controlling for climate and soil type is to conduct a field experiment. And we had several quite long-term field experiments that we sampled as part of this study. So we had Scrime experiment at Horsham that had been going for 12 years, and the MC14 experiment at Walpia that had been going for 27 years, and the LR1 experiment at Horsham that had been going for 94 years. And so I'll just run through the types of treatments these experiments had. The different crop rotations at Scrime have sort of modern crop rotations with wheat, some legume, pea, lucerne, phases, green manure. They had canola and fallow options in there. The MC14 experiment had 3 crop rotations with either various combinations of fallow and wheat and medic pasture, with 2 different cultivation types, conventional cultivation with stubble incorporated and zero tillage with stubble left standing. And then the LR1 experiment was quite old rotation, so we had one of the treatments as continuous wheat, and then those fallow options with different cereals, a pasture, and pea options in the rotations. Now, when we sampled them, our hypotheses were we expected that the carbon stocks would be greater where we have zero tillage compared with conventional tillage. You would have more carbon where you have continuous cropping versus where you have fallows in the rotation. And we expected that crop legumes or pasture in the rotations would have more carbon than continuous cropping with cereals and oilseeds. And what we found, so firstly, zero tillage did increase carbon by 8% at the most, or had no effect. In the older experiments, zero tillage increased carbon. In the 12-year experiment, it didn't have any effect. And then secondly, the continuous cropping, as opposed to having fallows in the rotation, had increased carbon by 8 to 12% across all the experiments. Thirdly, the legumes or pasture in rotations. The grain legume, field pea, increased carbon by a remarkable 29 to 35%. That was in the 90-odd-year-old experiment, but it had no effect in the 12-year experiment. The legume pasture medic, lucerne, increased carbon by about 21%, or in the 12-year experiment, that was in the 27-year experiment, in the 12-year experiment it had no effect. And vetch green manure had no effect, and a non-legume pasture, which was oat, had no effect on soil carbon. And these were both in the 12-year experiment. So obviously the signal is much stronger in these very old experiments. There's the trouble with soil carbon that sometimes it can take 10 years before you can measure effects, or more, as in this case. We also had one long-term pasture experiment. It's at Hamilton. At the time it had been going for 35 years, and it had different rates of superphosphate applied, between 1 and 33 kilograms per year, and 4 different grazing intensities to match that, from very light up to very heavy. And these treatments, they produced enormous differences in dry matter production, pasture production. And so we started with the hypothesis that where you get greater pasture production, you'd also get more soil carbon. What we actually found was there was no difference across any of the treatments. Variability was high across the site. There was more variation within a plot than there was between plots. The carbon levels were reasonably high across the whole site, but none of the differences in carbon were due to the fertilizer or grazing treatments. And that sort of was initially surprising, but on reflection, it seems reasonable. And if people are interested, I can go into speculation of why we got these results later. So yes, just to race through it quite quickly. This is the overall findings of these 2 programs. We could say the conclusions are that soil carbon is mostly determined by climate and soil, and the influence of management is relatively small. So to measure management effects, we need to remove the climate and soil effects, or control them in some way, account for them. And with current practices, and really we didn't measure novel practices in these studies. It was practices that had been conducted for, that are well established in the industries. With these practices, carbon sequestration is difficult, it's slow, and the amounts that can be sequestered are very small. And the biggest increase we found was when biggest increase in carbon was when you have a cropped soil, a soil that had been cropped for a long time, and it's converted to pasture. And you do get an increase in carbon. But how much of that is through sequestration is open to question, because generally with the pasture you put on a grazing animal, and if you discount the methane from the animal, the sequestration would be reduced. A big conclusion is once carbon's lost, it's really difficult to restore. And this is because you also get loss of nutrients and loss of soil structure, and that just really makes it hard to build up again. So to farmers wanting to engage with the soil carbon sequestration, this might seem a little bit pessimistic. And our messages for the industry at the time, would be soil carbon sequestration has many benefits, but it is realistically currently quite difficult using these conventional practices. There are 2 principles that you could say are helpful in aiming for carbon sequestration. number one, prevent unnecessary loss. So soil erosion, prevent at all costs, and unnecessary cultivation. And then growing and retaining more plant material. Now that might be easier to say than to do. But we have these practices that we know tend to help retaining carbon, and there's not any one of them could guarantee that you get carbon sequestration, but the more of them you do, the greater the chances of sequestering carbon, but there's no guarantees. So that was sort of where we ended up after that research. And yeah, where we are now, maybe not now, but at the end of that research, we now have a much better understanding of soil carbon in Australian soils and globally as well in agricultural systems, right across scientific and farming and government communities, but there's still lots of basic stuff that we don't know. We now have a carbon trading scheme that includes soil carbon, so theoretically you can trade carbons. How to do it is still, well, Matthew will talk a little bit more about that, but so using conventional practices, the prospects for sequestering carbon, you'd have to say, are limited. There's still, however, great interest and probably potential in soil carbon sequestration, both for the soil improvement and greenhouse mitigation aspects. But we need innovation in this space, and we need better understanding of how we can achieve more and faster and more reliable carbon sequestration in farming systems. So, yeah, that's where we've ended up. I just mentioned this, you may have heard of the 4 per 1,000 initiative, which started in Europe, started by the French. It aims to increase soil carbon levels across the globe by 0.4% per year by using better farm management practices. That's wildly optimistic, or it's and there's a lot of discussion in science literature about how achievable or not achievable it is, but it may just be an aspirational target, and if they can get some way towards that, it can only be good. It's not, this figure of 0.4% is not developed from any scientific understanding of how carbon builds up in soil or anything. They just took the amount of emissions from fossil fuels and divided them by the amount of carbon stocks on the globe, on the Earth, and came up with a figure of 0.4. If we could increase soil carbon by 0.4% per year, we could mitigate all the fossil fuel emissions. So I think Australia has signed up to this initiative as well. So you'll probably be hearing more about this in coming years. I don't think interest in soil carbon is going to wane for a while yet. So on that point, I'll finish. I'll answer some questions if you've got some, and hand over to Matthew. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Just while Fiona has just a small drink it's now is the time to be typing in your questions. Now, Fiona, you should be able to see, I think there was one question there at the moment. If you could go over to the chat and look at that.
Okay.
And I'll just do a quick spiel about, as you can see, next Tuesday we have Professor Roger Armstrong, who is part of some of the teams that Fiona's been part of, to talk about the grain yields with organic matter. So although within the Macedon Ranges Shire we don't have a lot of grain production, I'm sure that some of the learnings from his research will be applicable in some of our areas. Also coming up, we've got some local farmers' journey in holistic farming coming up again on the Tuesday night around this time. Keep an eye out on the website at the Macedon Ranges Shire Council Sustainable Farming, and that will have some of the upcoming events, and also we'll have a recording of this event at that particular when it comes up, hopefully in the next week or so. So I will hand back over. So Fiona, can you see those few questions there on the
yes,
chat?
Yep. So I'll just answer some of these if I can. There's a question there: have you investigated the carbon levels with soil bacteria levels or activity? Yeah, we didn't study the microorganisms per se. I think it would be safe to say, though, as carbon levels go up, microbial activity levels, bacteria, fungi, go up as well. The microorganisms respond to the energy source, carbon, decomposable carbon, firstly, and also moisture and nutrients. So but really strongly to carbon. So I think in most cases it'd be a fair assumption that you're improving your microbial activity if you're improving your soil carbon. So I hope that answers that question. There's a question here: is there somewhere you would recommend to get a decent organic carbon soil test done in this area? The major labs, I'm not really that familiar with what's on offer for like farming related samples, but say something like Nutrient Advantage, the Incitec Pivot Lab, they're good. They give you reliable results. But as I said previously, it's really important to ask for organic carbon and not just get a total carbon figure. And how you take the sample is actually really important as well. You're really careful with the depth, and you need multiple cores in a paddock to get an idea, because soil carbon's notoriously variable spatially. So within 6 meters, it could change quite a lot. So you need a lot of cores. So could you please talk about the benefits of products like biochar? Okay, well, I'll have a go. I'm not an expert on this, but yeah, so biochar it's really stabilized carbon from any sort of feedstock, any organic material. And there's biochar and biochar, depending on how it's made. Some of it actually breaks down reasonably quicker than you expect, and some of it is almost inert, and that affects the properties on the soil. And there's been various trials with biochar. Some have shown increases in production and some have not, and I think there's a lot that goes into that. I don't think you can make categorical statements about whether it's good or bad. It depends on the situation and what was wrong with your soil in the first place. As a means of sequestering carbon, the sequestration actually happens at the pyrolysis plant when the biochar is made. Applying it to the soil hasn't been shown to sequester more carbon, and that was one of the the hopes for biochar is that it would promote carbon sequestration once it was put on the soil as well. But as far as I know, that hasn't been shown yet. So I'm not sure if I've answered the question, but it's complex, and yeah, maybe you should try and get a bit of an expert to talk about it. But there's not that much information out there on biochar actually. Even for scientists, it's hard to get information. So there's a question about where can I go to inquire about getting my soil tested? Well,
so Fiona, I'll just jump in there. We did that. We did the soil testing one last week. So some of that information can be directed through me, and I'll hand it on to Rebecca as a good person that talked about soil and the soil and the ability to test mix. So that's probably a good thing to talk to Rebecca, who's out there doing soil testing a lot more than what Fiona would be.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. Thanks. And there's quite a few reputable labs out there. It shouldn't be difficult to find a place. There's another question from Dean. The SCARP program actually did capture some, maybe at least 6 to 10 examples of high inexplicable soil organic carbon referred to as outliers, and hence were not statistically included, according to CSIRO, who now concede that they would like to study how this was achieved. We know that these results were independently verified by Sydney Uni, EAL Labs, and other scientists. We are also seeing evidence of this in the USA. Refer Gabe Brown. Have you had experience with these? Okay, yeah, well, I guess this is news to me, these outliers. If this is CSIRO, I don't know which state, they weren't from Victorian samples anyway, I know that. Yes, the outliers are interesting, and we need to pay attention to the outliers because they're outliers for a reason. And once you rule out, some error in the sampling or the analysis, then they become really interesting. In our experience of SCARP, even if you have the same soil type, the same climate, supposedly the same management, you still get a very wide range of soil carbon levels. And that tells you there's a lot of factors influencing the soil carbon that we hadn't taken account of, that we hadn't measured, that we couldn't identify. So, yeah, this is one thing that intrigues me actually, and one of the things I would like to in future follow up, and to find out some of these factors to understand why some soils hold more carbon than others, and even when they supposedly have similar managements. So, yeah, I guess that's the only comment or response to your comment, Dean. But yeah, it's certainly very interesting, and yeah, we should never just ignore the outliers. So, Dean, I hope that's answered your question. So there's another question here. If we were to get our soil tested in the Macedon Ranges region, what would be considered a poor, good, or great, excellent level of carbon? Okay, so Macedon region, unfortunately, it was one region we didn't sample. But, well, maybe Jason, you can enlighten me, but I think that they have quite a lot of light soils there.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have lots of heavy clays and.
Well, it depends where everyone is. So there's a range like everywhere, the granite soils through to some heavier loams.
Okay.
Some traditional grazing. Yeah, so there's you can see there's a couple that are coming through with heavy clays at different areas. So there's a big range.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a bit tricky because if you say you've got a very sandy soil, you're going to have a low carbon level, and that might be good for a sand, but it's still really low. Just, it seems to be really impossible to build up carbon in sandy soils. It just burns off so quick. It doesn't get retained. In less sandy soils, more loamy clay soils that are cropped, you would hope to have a carbon concentration of 2%, say in the top 10 centimetres. That would be reasonable. A lot of our cropping soils are a lot lower than that, especially in the drier regions. They'd be well below 1%. For permanent pastures, long-term pastures, you'd be looking at least 3.5%, I would say. And I've seen probably up to 6%. That's not to say that that's the limit, though. So we don't actually have clear cut-offs for, what's good or bad. And it depends a lot on how you're managing the system. Like, you can actually grow really good crops on something that's just almost beach sand, as long as you put on the water and the nutrients. So you can sort of get away with having low carbon levels for a while.
Okay, thank you very much, Fiona, and we will